In the worst blizzard the valley had seen in decades, an old man living alone at the forest's edge woke to a faint scratching at his door at 2:47 a.m. When he opened it, there was no neighbor, no traveler, only a dying lioness dragging her 4 frozen cubs onto his porch. But what truly froze him wasn't the cold. It was the scar on her shoulder, a memory he thought he'd buried forever. The first thing Jack Whitmore heard was the wind trying to tear his old cabin off the side of the mountain. It howled through the pines and around the eaves, a steady, angry roar that had been building for hours. The second thing he heard was the clock on the wall, ticking a little too loud in the silence between gusts. The third sound did not belong in a blizzard. It was soft. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Scratch, like something small and tired dragging its claws across wood. Jack lay there in the dark for a long second, his brain arguing with his ears. Nothing should be out there. Not in a storm like this. Not at this hour. He turned his head toward the red glow of the digital clock. 2:47 a.m. The wind hammered the cabin again, rattling the window panes. The scratching came a little louder this time, a weak insistence right at the front door. Jack swung his legs out from under the covers and felt the cold bite his bare feet, even through the old hardwood floor. His knees popped, his back complained, the usual chorus of a 61-year-old body that had spent too many years in the field. He grabbed the flannel shirt from the chair, shrugged into it, and reached for the flashlight he kept on the nightstand. The storm had already knocked the power out around midnight. The cabin was running on the wood stove and a few battery lanterns now. Outside, the blizzard raged like something alive. Scratch. This time it was followed by a sound that made the hair on his arm stand up. A thin, broken whimper. Not human, not a dog. Something caught between a growl and a cry. Jack's heartbeat picked up as he stepped into his boots without socks and shuffled down the short hallway. The cabin was small, just 3 rooms and a porch, built decades ago on the edge of the forest bordering Yellowstone. He'd lived here alone since Linda died. The silence had become his companion. Tonight it felt like it was holding its breath. At the front door he hesitated, one hand on the deadbolt, the other holding the flashlight. For a moment he considered ignoring it, letting whatever was out there find its own fate. Any sane animal would have gone to ground hours ago. Anything still moving in this would be desperate, or sick, or dangerous. But that thin, broken sound came again. "Easy now," he muttered, more to himself than to whatever waited on the other side. His voice sounded old in the dark. "We're coming. We're coming." He cracked the deadbolt, moved the chain aside, and braced his shoulder. When he opened the door, the storm punched its way in. A wall of air sharp as glass. Snow swirled into the entryway, blown sideways, the wind shrieking around the doorframe. The flashlight beam cut through the chaos in a narrow cone of white. At first he saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then the light fell to the porch floor. Jack sucked in a breath that burned his lungs. Collapsed against the threshold, half in the drift and half out, lay a lioness. Not an African lion from some zoo, but a big tawny cat that should have been miles away in the back country, not on his porch. Her sides heaved in shallow, ragged breaths. Ice had formed along her whiskers and in the fur around her muzzle. Her paw pads were split and bloody, pressed into the snow as if she'd crawled the last few feet. And under her belly, pressed tight against her, were 4 small shapes. For a heartbeat, Jack's mind refused to understand what he was seeing. The shapes were all wrong in the stormlight, just little lumps of fur and frozen tails and tiny paws. Then one of them moved, a weak twitch of a head, a mouth opening in a soundless cry. Cubs. 4 lion cubs. They were stiff with cold, their fur crusted with ice, their little bodies tucked under their mother as if she had been trying to shield them with the last of her warmth. One was barely breathing, its sides fluttering like a dying bird's. "Dear God," Jack whispered. He stepped out into the wind, ignoring the sting on his face. The lioness's eyes fluttered open, 2 pale amber lamps in the storm. They met his, and for a moment the roar of the wind faded. There was no threat in that gaze, no wild panic, just exhaustion so deep it looked like surrender, and something else beneath it. Recognition. Jack's hand shook as he lifted the flashlight higher, letting the beam sweep up her side, over the ribs that showed a little too clearly, across the shoulder where the snow had melted and refrozen. The light caught a line in the fur there, a twisted patch of scar tissue that ran from just behind her neck, down over the left shoulder blade, a long, ugly scar. He knew that scar. His knees gave a little, and he almost went down right there on the porch. The storm came rushing back into his ears, but his focus had narrowed to that single patch of damaged skin. "No," he breathed. "No, it can't be you." A year's worth of sleepless nights and half-finished thoughts crashed into him all at once. The roaring fire line, the falling trees, the smell of smoke so thick it coated his teeth. The sight of a young lioness trapped between 2 burning trunks, eyes wide and wild. His own voice, hoarse from shouting into a radio and over the wind. The frantic scramble to cut her loose, drag her out of that tightening ring of fire. Turning his back for 1 minute to help a fallen firefighter, and turning back to find her gone, leaving only bloody tracks and a smear of fur on the ash. He had convinced himself she'd crawled off somewhere and died, that his help had come too late, that the pain in her eyes, that last look she'd thrown back at him over her shoulder as he pulled her clear, had turned into a slow, lonely death in the dark. The guilt had sat on his chest ever since, like a stone, and now she was here, on his porch, in the worst blizzard he could remember. With 4 cubs. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, the flashlight clattering to the boards. His hands went to the cubs first, on pure instinct, feeling for life with fingers that had done this too many times with too many small, broken things. Their bodies were frighteningly cold, but there were faint heartbeats, tiny shudders of breath. The lioness's gaze followed every movement. When his hand brushed her side by accident, she didn't flinch, didn't growl. She just let out a low, rusted sound that might once have been a purr. Her head sagged a little closer to the floor. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, the words coming out rough and thick. "You walked all this way, didn't you? You came right back to the only fool you knew." His vision blurred. It took him a second to realize it wasn't just the snow in his eyes. He was crying. Not the hot, angry tears he had shed at funerals and fire lines, but a slow, helpless spill that warmed his cheeks and then froze in the wind. He reached out with one trembling hand and laid it very gently on the lioness's neck, feeling the faint, fluttering beat there. "I remember you," he said softly, leaning close so she could hear through the wind. "I remember that scar. I remember those eyes." The lioness blinked once slowly. Her gaze slid from his face to the open door behind him, where a rectangle of dim yellow light leaked out into the storm, carrying the smell of wood smoke and warmth and life. Then she shifted her weight just a fraction, as if gathering whatever strength she had left. With a low, painful grunt, she pushed forward an inch, nudging the cubs with her chest. One rolled clumsily toward the threshold, its tiny claws scraping against the frozen boards. She pushed again, jaw clenched, breath rattling, moving them inch by inch closer to the dark warmth beyond Jack's boots. He understood then. She hadn't come for herself. She had come for them. Something in his chest cracked open. The old cabin, the storm, the long, lonely years since Linda's death, all of it dropped away until there was only this mother, broken and dying on his porch, and the 4 lives she was handing to him. "All right," he choked out. "All right, I've got them. I've got you." He scooped up the first cub, feeling how light it was, how frighteningly limp. Then the second, tucking them close against his chest under his shirt, trying to share what little heat his old body had. Behind him, the wind howled and the lioness sagged back, her head lowering to the boards. As he stepped backward into the cabin, clutching the shivering bundles, Jack looked once more at the scar on her shoulder, the same scar he'd seen through waves of heat and smoke a year ago. The same animal he had failed to save, now lying on his doorstep, because somehow she had believed in him more than he had ever believed in himself. He saw that scar and cried harder than he had cried in 40 years. Then he kicked the door shut against the storm and ran for the fire, 4 frozen cubs in his arms, and a dying lioness waiting on his porch in the dark. The fire in the wood stove crackled low and steady, filling the small cabin with a warmth that felt almost unreal after the chaos on the porch. Jack knelt beside the hearth, rubbing the 4 cubs gently with an old flannel blanket he'd warmed near the coals. Their tiny bodies trembled under his hands, some from returning warmth, some from fear, some from the edge of death they'd hovered near for hours. He worked slowly, carefully, the way he'd once handled injured owlets and fawns during field rescues, but these were lion cubs. 4 lion cubs who should have been asleep in a den miles from here, wrapped in their mother's thick living heat, not lying on an old rug in the home of a lonely widower. Behind him, snow continued to hammer the walls, the wind shrieking in long, uneven notes. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the closed door, listening for a sound from the lioness. He had dragged her inside not long after the cubs, laying her near the fire, but far enough that she wouldn't panic if she woke. Her breathing was faint, slow, but still present. That fact alone felt like a miracle. Jack slipped a hand under one cub's jaw and lifted its head slightly. Its eyes remained closed, lashes iced together. The little creature let out a weak squeak, a sound so small and fragile it made Jack's throat tighten. "Hang in there, little one," he whispered. "Your mama fought like hell to get you here. The least you can do is give her something to fight for." The cub stirred, pushing its nose into his palm. That tiny movement pulled Jack back through a year he had tried so hard to forget. The memory came not in pieces, but in one overwhelming wave, the heat, the smoke, the screaming wind inside the burning timber line. Jack hadn't wanted to be there that day. He was supposed to be retired. Linda had always told him he'd leave this world in a fire line someday if he didn't slow down. After she died, slowing down had felt worse than any risk. He took every call, every shift, anything that kept him from the empty house and the ache inside it. The fire that day had moved like a living thing, leaping treetops, swallowing acres within minutes. Jack had been scanning a stretch of fallen pines when he heard something that didn't fit the roaring blaze. A deep, raw cry, part fury, part terror, part pain. Not human, not anything he had heard from local wildlife before. He followed the sound through curtains of heat until he found her. A young lioness, half pinned beneath 2 charred logs, her left, shoulder torn open by splintered wood. Her fur was streaked with ash, eyes wide and glassy with fear. She tried to rise when she saw him, her instincts pleading for escape, but the pain forced her back down. Jack remembered the way she had looked at him then. Not wild, not savage, just scared and burning. "Easy, girl," he had said, voice hoarse from smoke. "Easy now. I'm here." Those same words had come out of his mouth tonight, all on their own. He could still feel the heat of the flames as he'd worked his crowbar under the logs, prying one loose enough to drag her out. She had cried out, a deep, shuddering sound that shook him more than the fire did. He'd thrown his jacket over her to block some of the sparks, ignoring the blistering heat that scorched the fabric. And then, for a single heartbeat, she had rested her head against his knee. Just a small, shaking touch. Not trust, not yet, but something close. A plea. Jack had pulled her clear of the fire, dragging both of them into a pocket of air where the smoke thinned. He remembered shouting into his radio for medical support, his voice cracking. When he turned back, maybe 10 seconds later, she was gone, limped away, blood marking each step, disappearing into a wall of smoke. He'd searched until the fire captain forced him to evacuate. Days later, he walked those slopes again, looking for any sign she'd survived. He never found tracks, bones, or any trace at all. Eventually, he convinced himself she had died somewhere alone. Tonight shattered that belief. Jack blinked ears as another cub wriggled weakly beside him. He reached for a small bowl of warm water and touched a drop to its lips. The cub latched onto the warmth, tongue flicking, tiny throat swallowing. Relief washed over him so sharply he had to steady his hand on the rug. "You're fighters," he murmured, "just like she is." He glanced behind him at the Lioness. She lay stretched beside the far wall, her breathing shallow but steadier now that she was out of the storm. Her fur glistened where melted ice had soaked through. The scar on her shoulder stood out in the firelight, jagged, healed wrong, unmistakable. "Why'd you come back to me?" he whispered. "Why remember me at all?" The Lioness stirred faintly at the sound of his voice. One ear twitched. Slowly, painfully, her eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, dazed, but after a few breaths, they found him. And something in them, something old and tired and familiar, came alive. Jack felt the same shock as when he opened the door earlier, only this time it was deeper, quieter, threaded with a grief he didn't have words for. "You remembered," he breathed. The Lioness blinked once. Her gaze shifted to the cubs, then back to him. A simple exchange, yet the weight of it settled on Jack like a hand on his shoulder. She was asking him to finish what she had started, to keep them alive, to keep her alive long enough to see them safe. Jack swallowed hard and turned his attention back to the cubs, rubbing their small paws between his fingers, warming them, urging circulation back into their limbs. One cub whimpered, a tiny, broken sound, and the Lioness's body tensed, though she couldn't rise. "You rest," Jack said softly. "I've got them." He didn't know if she understood, but he said it anyway, because saying it felt like a promise he had already made without realizing it. The storm raged on outside. The fire spit a small spark. The cubs breathed, uneven but alive, and in the dim, trembling light of that cabin, Jack felt the past and present overlap in a way that made his chest ache. A year ago he had dragged this Lioness from the edge of fire. Tonight she had dragged herself to his door through ice and death, carrying 4 lives he now held in his hands. He had saved her then. She was asking him to save her again now. And somewhere deep inside his tired, winter-worn heart, Jack knew this was only the beginning. By the time the first gray hint of dawn began to seep through the frosted windows, Jack's body felt like it belonged to somebody else. He'd sat up with the cubs most of the night, dozing in short, guilty snatches, waking every time one of them whimpered or twitched. The wood stove had eaten through 2 full armloads of split pine. The cabin air was thick with the smell of smoke, wet fur, and something wild that didn't quite belong, but somehow felt right. The cubs were better, not out of danger, not by a long stretch, but better. Their fur had dried into soft, uneven tufts. Their paws no longer felt like ice in his hands. They lay in a tight knot on the old braided rug, bellies pressed together, tiny chests rising and falling in a rhythm that had steadied over the last hour. Every now and then one would twitch in its sleep, batting at some invisible thing, already dreaming of chasing. Their mother had not moved much. She lay where he had dragged her, near the wall opposite the stove, on a layer of blankets he'd sacrificed from his own bed. Her sides rose and fell slowly, but the breath sounded deeper now, less like the last shudders of a failing fire, and more like coals trying to catch again. Her eyes were closed. In the half-light, the scar on her shoulder looked like an old riverbed, twisting and pale against the tawny fur. Jack forced himself up from the floor, his joints protesting. He needed more firewood. He needed coffee. And he needed to take a look outside. The storm had quieted sometime after midnight, trading its scream for a low, steady moan. The snow still fell, but not in the sideways fury it had thrown against the cabin earlier. Now it drifted down in heavy, lazy flakes, piling on top of what the blizzard had already left. Silence pressed against the walls like another blanket. Jack shrugged into his coat, pulled a beanie over his thinning hair, and grabbed the old .30-30 rifle from the rack by the door. Habit more than fear. Out here, you didn't step outside in the half-light without some kind of insurance. He cracked the door slowly, letting in a blade of air so cold it made his teeth ache. The porch was buried under a fresh drift, smooth as a sheet on a deathbed. The wind had sculpted the snow into strange, soft shapes, as if the world were a landscape made of meringue. But the snow closest to the door wasn't smooth at all. It was broken, churned up, marked. Jack stepped out, the boards creaking under his weight. To wait, and lifted his eyes. For a moment his breath caught again, but for a different reason than the night before. Tracks. They were everywhere, not just the deep, staggering trail the lioness had left dragging herself those last desperate feet. Smaller prints surrounded them, tiny, overlapping pads from the cubs' earlier attempts to walk before their strength gave out. He could see where one had stumbled, rolled, where the mother had circled back to nudge it forward. The story of their final approach to his door was written right there in the snow. But those weren't the tracks that made his stomach tighten. Beyond the small, messy cluster were broader, heavier impressions. Wolf. Jack stepped to the edge of the porch, rifle hanging forgotten in one hand. He'd seen plenty of wolf sign over the years, but rarely this close to the cabin. And never like this. The prints moved in a rough half-circle around his home, weaving in and out among the trees, their paths converging and splitting again. He counted at least 5 distinct sets, maybe more. They had come right up to the clearing, stopped, prowled, waited. Oh, hell, he murmured. He followed the trail with his eyes, tracing it in the soft morning light. The wolves had approached from the north, noses tuned to the scent of blood and fear and desperation. The lioness's tracks told a terrible story, how she'd slowed, stumbled, forced herself onward anyway. The wolves had ghosted along beside her trail, just outside of sight, testing the air, testing her strength. At one point, barely 30 yards from the tree line, he saw where the snow had exploded into chaos. The lioness's prints deepened there, claw marks gouging into the crust. Wolf tracks overlapped in a tight cluster, circling, pressing in, then retreating. The snow was stained with something darker, frozen into rusty patches. Jack's jaw clenched. He didn't have to be there to know what had happened. She hadn't just outrun the storm. She had fought her way through it. Somewhere in that swirling white hell, with 4 half-frozen cubs depending on her, she'd turned and faced a pack that could have torn her apart in seconds. Maybe she'd lunged, teeth bared, just enough to convince them she still had fight left. Maybe she'd caught one on the muzzle, given it something to remember. Whatever she'd done, it had worked. For a while. The tracks showed the wolves pulling back, splitting again, shadowing her from a distance like dark thoughts. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw. "You stubborn girl," he said under his breath. "You must have scared the devil out of them." But he knew the truth. Wolves weren't easily scared. They were patient. They were opportunists. When prey was strong, they waited. When prey stumbled, they closed in. His cabin had been a line they hadn't been willing to cross. Not yet. A low sound rode the wind then, so soft he almost missed it. Not the groan of trees or the brushing of branches. A distant note, long and thin. He held his breath. It came again from somewhere deep in the timber, a high, mournful howl, answered a heartbeat later by another, and then a third, lower and rougher. They were still out there. Jack's fingers tightened around the rifle stock. He had dealt with wolves before, back when he wore a badge and a uniform. He respected them, even admired them in a way. But admiration didn't change the simple fact that to a hungry winter pack, a weakened lioness and 4 clumsy cubs were not symbols of courage. They were meat. He stood there longer than he should have, the cold gnawing up through his boots, watching his breath drift away in little clouds while the forest voices faded back into the vast quiet. The sky was beginning to pale over the ridge, turning the storm clouds into a dirty pink smear. Behind him, from inside the cabin, came a faint sound, a cub giving a thin, questioning cry. It snapped him out of his trance. Jack turned back toward the door and stepped inside, locking it behind him out of habit more than hope. A deadbolt wouldn't stop a determined wolf, but wood and iron and human scent might make them think twice. The change in temperature made his cheeks burn. He set the rifle back in its place, stomping snow from his boots, and moved to check on his patients. The cubs stirred as he approached, one of them emitting a tiny, impatient grumble that made him huff a tired smile. "Yeah, I hear you," he said softly. "Breakfast, right? Same as every youngster I've ever met." He knelt and laid a hand against the lioness's flank. Her fur was warmer now. When he pressed his palm there, he felt the slow, steady drum of her heart. As if in answer, her eyelids fluttered open. For a moment he said nothing, just met her gaze, the faint echoes of the wolf howls still ringing in his ears. "They were on you," he told her quietly. "They followed you all the way here." Her pupils tightened slightly, as if she understood the shape of danger in his voice, if not the words themselves. Her eyes flicked toward the door, then back to him. "Well," Jack went on, his voice rough but steady, "they're not getting you here. Not while I'm breathing." The promise hung in the warm air like smoke. He wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, her, the cubs, or himself. Maybe all of them. Outside, deep in the snow-laden woods, the wolves settled, into their own kind of waiting. Inside the cabin, a retired ranger, a dying lioness, and 4 fragile cubs faced the long day ahead, bound together now by something beyond fear. They were no longer just visitors, passing through each other's world. They were, for this storm and whatever came after it, a single, shared line between life and death. For the next several hours, as the storm slowly relaxed its grip on the mountains, Jack worked inside the cabin with the quiet focus of a man who had spent half his life tending to the wounded. But even while his hands moved across the cubs' small bodies, warming them, checking their breathing, his mind kept drifting back, pulled by some invisible thread to the place where this night had begun for the Lioness. The den, the collapse, the storm, and the impossible journey that had led her to his door. While the cubs slept and the Lioness dozed in exhausted fits, the room dim and warm around them, Jack found himself staring into the fire and seeing not flames, but memory. Memory not his own, but the kind he pieced together from the clues she had left in the snow. He could almost feel it, the moment the world had turned against her. Somewhere miles north of his cabin, the storm had broken suddenly over the ridge line, dropping the temperature in a terrifying plunge. Winds screamed down the slopes, ripping at old pines, shaking loose branches that hadn't moved in decades. The forest floor had groaned under the weight of the blizzard's first wave, then failed. Jack pictured it as clearly as if he'd been standing there himself. The Lioness curled around her cubs in a small den beneath the sweep of a fallen cedar, her body arched over them, her breath warming their tiny faces. The cubs were only weeks old, soft, clumsy things that didn't yet understand danger. For them, the world began and ended in the safe rhythm of their mother's heartbeat. Then the cedar had shifted. A crack, a rush of cold air, and the ceiling fell. Jack saw her lunging without hesitation, catching the nearest cub by the scruff, dragging it through the collapsing snow while the others cried out behind her. He saw her dig, her paws bleeding, breaking through to the second cub, then the third, then the last, all four alive, all shivering terribly, pressed against her as she braced her broken shoulder against the wind. The storm wanted them dead. Nature didn't negotiate with newborns. Jack let out a slow breath, imagining her trying to scan the world through snow thick as wool. No shelter, no cover, no heat. Only the cold certainty that if she stayed where she was, all four cubs would die in less than an hour. And that was when memory had found her. Not scent, not instinct, memory. Jack's voice, the heat of his coat as he covered her in the fire, the rough gentleness of the hands that freed her from the burning logs, the strange creature who had carried her out of death instead of leaving her to it, and somewhere through the whiteout she had remembered a direction, a smell, a warmth, a man. Now Jack could see the first steps of that terrible journey. The Lioness, limping from her old wound, lifting the weakest cub gently into her jaws. The snow nearly swallowed her. The drifts were already knee-deep for a man, waist-deep for her. Each step must have felt like wading through ice that wanted to swallow her whole. 17 miles, in a storm that could kill an elk in minutes. Jack stared at the Lioness now, asleep on his blankets. Her paws twitched in some dream he could not know. He swallowed hard. "You should be dead," he whispered. "Everything in that storm wanted you dead." But she hadn't died. She had walked. He imagined the second trip. After dropping the first cub somewhere near a sheltered rock or a shallow snowdrift, somewhere she prayed it might survive a few minutes, she had turned and gone back for the others. The wind would have erased her paw prints almost instantly. She must have navigated by memory alone, fighting the numbness creeping into her limbs. Then the third trip, her strength failing, her breath burning, her injured shoulders screaming under the weight of snow. And on the fourth trip, when she'd come for the last cub, the largest one, the loudest one, Jack could see it perfectly, the wolves appearing as shadows first, then shapes, closing in at the edge of the storm. He saw her lower her head, baring her teeth, planting herself between the wolves and her baby. The pack testing her, circling, snipping at the air, looking for weakness. She must have fought with everything she had, her bad shoulder taking blows it couldn't afford. And yet she won, or at least survived long enough to escape. Jack rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it settle behind his eyes. "You walked through hell," he murmured, "and hell followed you the whole way." He looked over at the cubs again. They slept in a tangle of paws and soft breath, warm under the blanket he'd laid over them. They had no idea what their mother had done. No idea how close they had come to dying beneath the snow, or in the jaws of wolves, or in the cold somewhere between the den and his door. He stood slowly, stretching his sore back, and walked over to the Lioness. Kneeling beside her, he eased one hand under her jaw, feeling the faint warmth of her breath against his wrist. Her fur was softer now that it was dry. "How did you know I was still here?" he whispered. The Lioness did not wake, but her ear twitched, the faintest hint of awareness. Jack let his hand rest against her cheek. "I don't know what you remembered," he said softly, "but I swear, I'll make it worth it." A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Snow slid off the roof with a heavy thump. Somewhere far off in the forest, a wolf answered the storm with a lonely howl. The Lioness stirred at the sound, a faint growl rising in her throat before fading again. Even, half conscious, she was still protecting them. Jack stood slowly, looking from mother to cubs, then to the frosted window. The journey had ended at his door, but their fight for life had only begun. And as he threw more wood into the stove and watched the flames rise, he understood something clearly for the first time. If she could walk 17 miles through roaring death without giving up, then he sure as hell wasn't going to give up either. By late morning, the blizzard had weakened into a thin, steady snow, the kind that fell quietly as if trying to apologize for the night before. But inside Jack Whitmore's cabin, the storm had left its mark on everything, on the trembling cubs huddled together under the flannel blanket, on the half-conscious Lioness stretched across his old quilts, and on Jack himself, whose face looked a little older in the firelight than it had the day before. The warmth rising from the wood stove slowly pushed back the cold that had seeped into the cabin's bones. Jack knelt on the floor beside the cubs, checking each one with hands that were gentle despite their rough skin and swollen knuckles. He'd spent a lifetime tending wounded animals, but never something like this. Never a creature that could grow into a hunter strong enough to break his ribs with a single careless swipe. Yet here they were, tiny and fragile, depending entirely on him. And here he was, unable to imagine doing anything but helping them. The smallest cub, the little one with a pale patch along its nose, let out a tiny squeak when Jack lifted it. He warmed some goat's milk on the stove, just enough to take the chill off, then dipped his finger in and nudged it toward the cub's mouth. The cub latched on, weak but determined. Jack exhaled a long, slow breath of relief. "That's it, sweetheart," he murmured. "You keep that up, and you'll be bossing your siblings around in no time." Behind him, a scrape of claws sounded against the floorboards, soft but unmistakably from a grown animal. Jack turned his head just a little, not wanting to startle her. The Lioness had stirred. Her front paw flexed weakly. Her breathing deepened. She lifted her head an inch, then let it fall back down again, as if the weight of the world rested on her neck. When she blinked open her eyes, they were cloudy with exhaustion, but aware enough to search the room for her cubs. "They're right here," Jack said softly. "Safe, warm. I promise." He didn't know if she understood the words, but she understood his tone. Her gaze softened, tired, heavy, but calmer now. The muscles in her shoulders eased. She let out a low chuff, almost like a cat's purr dragged through gravel. Jack set the fed cub back under the blanket with the others. Then he moved to the Lioness, lowering himself to his knees beside her. "Let's take a look at you," he whispered. The wound along her shoulder, an old injury from the fire, had been aggravated by her fight through the storm. The fur around it was cracked with dried blood. Her paw pads were a mess, torn open from traveling through ice and rock. He dipped a clean cloth in warm water and let it rest on the wounds for a moment. To his surprise, the lioness did not flinch. She watched him the way she had watched him in the burning forest a year ago, steady, cautious, but with something deeper flickering behind the gold in her eyes. "You're letting me do this," he said under his breath. "I didn't expect that." He dabbed the wounds carefully, easing away ice and grit. When he reached for the salve, the lioness lifted her head, following the movement of his hand. That tiny effort told him more than any roar or snarl could have. She trusted him. Again. Still. "God Almighty," Jack whispered, voice breaking a little. "You came here believing I could fix this, didn't you?" A soft cry came from behind him, one of the cubs shifting under the blanket. The lioness tried to rise at the sound, her paw sliding across the wood. She managed to lift her chest halfway before her body gave out. She collapsed with a sharp grunt, panting hard. "Easy," Jack said, steadying her shoulder with both hands. "Stay down. Let me help you." But she didn't want help. What she wanted, what she needed, was to be near her cubs. She tried again, dragging herself forward inch by inch, her good paw scraping the floor. It was a painful sight, and Jack felt his throat tighten. "Hold on," he said quickly. He grabbed one of the blankets near the stove, folded it twice, then gently slid it beneath the cubs like a makeshift sled. They mewed as he lifted the edges, tugging the blanket a few inches toward their mother. When the cubs came close enough for her to smell them, the lioness exhaled a shuddering breath that sounded like relief and surrender all at once. She lowered her head to the blanket, nudging the nearest cub with her nose. It tried to climb toward her chest, pawing clumsily at her fur. She closed her eyes as if that tiny touch anchored her to the world. "There you go," Jack whispered. "That's better, isn't it?" He stepped back to give them space. The lioness curled her tail around the cubs as best she could, though she lacked the strength to gather them properly. They wriggled in closer, all four pressing against her belly, drawn by the faint rhythm of her heartbeat. The sight of them, mother and cubs reunited at last, hit Jack harder than he expected. It felt like watching something sacred, something ancient that had survived by sheer will. He leaned back against the wall and rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't know how you made it," he murmured. "Lord knows I wouldn't have." He stood slowly and moved to the kitchen counter, pouring himself coffee from the old enamel pot. The first sip burned his tongue, but he didn't mind. He needed the warmth. He needed something normal in a morning that felt anything but. A sudden knock, sharp and quick, hit the door. Jack nearly dropped the cup. For a heartbeat, he thought of wolves, though wolves didn't knock. Then he recognized the sound. Human knuckles. He swore under his breath and hurried to the door, glancing back at the lioness and her cubs. He grabbed the rifle, not to threaten, but to avoid being surprised. When he opened the door, a gust of cold air blew in along with a young woman bundled in a ranger's jacket, her cheek red from the wind. Emily Chen, 28, smart, tough, too honest for her own good, and the last person he wanted to see right now. "Jack," she said, breath fogging in the air. "Are you all right? We saw smoke during the storm, and—" She stopped, her eyes shifted past him and widened. "What is that?" she whispered. Jack stepped forward, blocking her view. "Emily, listen." "Jack," she said, voice tightening, "tell me that's not a mountain lion in your living room." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her face went pale. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. "If the department finds out, if wildlife control hears even a rumor, "Jack, they'll put her down. Immediately." Behind him, a cub let out a tiny cry. The lioness stirred weakly. Emily's expression shifted, fear giving way to confusion, then awe. "Are those babies?" Jack nodded once, slowly. Emily stared at him, the wind tugging at her coat, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "Oh, Jack," she breathed, "what in God's name have you gotten yourself into?" He looked back toward the lioness, her frail body curled protectively around her cubs. Then he looked at Emily, standing there with duty in her eyes and worry written across her face. "What I've gotten myself into," he said quietly, "is a promise." He stepped aside just enough for her to see the scene fully. The dying mother, the sleeping cubs, the firelight wrapping around them like fragile gold. "Help me," he said. "Please, just help me keep them alive." Emily stood silent for a long moment. Then she closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold. "All right," she whispered. "Let's keep your secret." Emily moved slowly into the cabin, her boots dripping snow onto the worn floorboards, her breath still shallow from the shock of what she'd just seen. Jack closed the door behind her, locking out the cold, and locking her into a secret she hadn't asked for but now couldn't step away from. The warmth inside hit her like a wall, the smell of pine wood burning, the faint musk of wild animal fur, and beneath it all, the sharp metallic edge of dried blood. She took 2 steps closer, then froze again. The lioness lay stretched across Jack's blankets, her breathing shallow but steady, her sides rising in a slow, exhausted rhythm. The cubs huddled against her belly, tiny bodies shifting under the blanket Jack had draped over them. Emily had seen a lot in her 6 years as a ranger, wounded elk, orphaned fox kits, the messy cruelty of nature, but never this, never a wild animal lying in a man's home as if it had chosen him. "Jack," she whispered, as if scared her voice might shatter the fragile peace in the room. This is impossible." Jack rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "Tell me about it." "No, you don't understand." Emily took a shaky breath. "If anyone from Wildlife Control hears you've got a lioness inside your cabin, they'll kill her." Jack finished for her. "I know." Her eyes darted to him. "Then why didn't you call someone? Why didn't you radio for help?" "Because she didn't come here for them," he said simply. "She came here for me." Emily stared at him as if he'd just spoken another language. Jack didn't blame her. If he hadn't lived through the last 24 hours, he wouldn't believe it either. She took another step forward, lowering herself to a crouch beside the cubs. One of them stirred, its tiny paw reaching blindly toward its mother's side. Emily's face softened. Just a fraction, but enough for Jack to see the conflict in her eyes. "They're so small," she murmured. "They shouldn't even be walking yet." "They weren't," Jack said. "Not really. She carried them." Emily lifted her head. "Through that storm?" "Jack, that blizzard killed a herd of mule deer up near the ridge. And she walked 17 miles? Jack nodded. 4 times. Emily stared at him again, disbelief slowly giving way to something like awe. She rose to her feet, crossing her arms over her chest, as if trying to hold on to a sense of logic, but logic had no place in the warm glow of that fire with a dying predator lying at her boots. "What do you want to do?" she finally asked. "Keep them alive," Jack said. "All of them." "That wasn't my question," Emily replied quietly. "What do you expect me to do?" Jack met her eyes. "Help me make sure nobody else finds out." Emily opened her mouth, closed it, then let out a long breath. "Jack, this is illegal, all the way illegal. A wild animal in captivity, especially a predator. I'm not holding her captive," he said. "She came here. She put her cubs in my hands. That's not captivity. That's trust. The word hung in the air, warm and heavy. Trust. Emily looked down at the lioness again. Her expression softened, the ranger instincts inside her warping into something gentler. She moved closer to the mother, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The lioness flicked one ear, watching her through half-lidded eyes, but made no move to rise. "She's dehydrated," Emily murmured. "Badly." "I know." "And her paw pads?" Emily knelt, examining the cracked, bleeding pads. "These are frostbitten. She might lose parts of them." Jack swallowed. "Just tell me what to do." Emily stood, brushing, her hands on her pants. "First, we treat her feet. Then we get those cubs fed. And after that—" She hesitated. "After that, we figure out how to keep this from becoming a death sentence for all of you." Jack nearly sagged with relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Emily said quietly. "If anyone from the department comes by for a welfare check after that storm and finds this—" She shook her head. "Your whole property could be seized, and I could lose my badge." "I won't let that happen," Jack said. "You might not get a choice." As if summoned by her words, the radio clip to Emily's belt crackled with static. A man's voice filtered through the static, thin and muffled. "Unit 3, do you copy? We're doing storm after checks on all ranger stations. Report within the hour." Emily froze. Jack felt his stomach drop. "They're coming here, aren't they?" he asked. Emily nodded slowly. "Standard protocol after a storm like this. They'll check every cabin, every station. They'll want eyes on you to make sure you didn't get snowed in or knocked out by a blowdown. We can't let them see her." "No," Emily agreed. "We can't." She turned toward the lioness again, her brain already working, weighing the risks. "We'll need to block the windows," she said, "and keep her quiet. And those cubs—" A small cub let out a faint, hungry cry, its voice echoing through the cabin like a tiny alarm bell. Emily's eyes tightened. "They're too young to stay silent." Jack felt a protective heat rise in his chest. "Then we do whatever it takes." Emily crossed to the window and pulled down the heavy, old wool blanket Jack kept for winter emergencies. She hammered a few nails into the wall with the heel of her boot, blocking out the light from outside. "We've got 1 hour," she said, her voice quickening. "I'll cover the other window. Jack, get more blankets over the door. And keep her comfortable. If she tries to rise and roars, we're done." Jack nodded and moved fast, adrenaline pushing aside exhaustion. As he worked, the lioness lifted her head again, watching him. Her gaze was clearer now, more focused. She saw the movement, saw Emily, saw the cubs, saw the frantic preparations. But she didn't panic. She only pulled the cubs closer with the last bit of strength she had, tucking them against her chest like treasures. Emily turned, saw that gesture, and swallowed hard. "She really does trust you," she whispered. Jack paused, his hand resting on a nail he'd been about to hammer. "No," he murmured, "she trusts us." Outside, the wind had finally died. Inside, the clock ticked down the minutes until the knock they all feared. The lioness closed her eyes, her breathing steadying. The cub shifted gently under the blanket. Emily fastened the last cover over the window. Jack stood guard at the door, listening for engines in the snow, all of them silent, all of them waiting, all of them bound together now by a secret no one could ever afford to break. By the end of the third day, the storm had finally loosened its grip on the valley. The sky stretched wide and pale, washed clean after the blizzard's rage, and the world outside Jack's cabin lay buried under a thick, silent blanket of white. The wolves had faded back into the timber, leaving only their tracks like ghost signatures in the drifts. The rangers had done their checks and moved on, none the wiser to what Jack and Emily had kept hidden behind those wool-covered windows. Inside the cabin, the The lioness was stronger. Not well, not yet, but stronger. She could lift her head without trembling. She could shift her weight enough to pull her cubs closer, though each movement still cost her. The cubs, now warm-fed and rested, had discovered their voices. Their mews filled the cabin with small, bright sounds that made Jack's tired heart feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. By the morning of the fourth day, Jack knew it was time. "We've got to get them outside a little," he said quietly, kneeling beside the lioness. "Just for some exercise. Some air." Emily, sitting on a stool by the stove, eyed him over a cup of coffee. "It's still freezing, Jack." "I know." He stroked the lioness's shoulder gently. "But those cubs can't grow up on a rug, and she needs to move, or that shoulder will lock up." Emily hesitated. She wasn't wrong to worry. An adult lioness outside, even wounded, was still a wild animal. But when she glanced at the lioness, who met her gaze with a quiet, exhausted calm, she nodded. "Short walk," Emily warned. "A few minutes, then we bring them back in." Jack smiled, just a small, weary lift of his mouth. "A few minutes is all I'm hoping for." He opened the door slowly, letting the cold seep in, and for a moment none of them moved. The lioness sniffed the air, her ears rotating forward. Something in the fresh scent stirred her, some memory of mountains and wind and space that didn't belong between four cabin walls. Jack stepped out first, crunching into snow that reached almost to his knees. He extended his hand, not touching her, just offering a direction. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "Let's see the world again." The lioness pushed herself onto her unsteady paws. She faltered at first, nearly collapsing, but then she locked her good leg beneath her and rose. The cubs squeaked in confusion as she moved, their tiny heads popping up from the blanket before tumbling over each other trying to follow. Emily scooped two up, Jack gathered the other two, and together they carried the cubs to the porch. The lioness stepped into the snow like it was something sacred. Her paws sank deep, but she didn't seem to mind the cold. Instead, she breathed in the air like she had been holding her breath for days. Her tail swayed once, a slow, weak arc that still held a hint of pride. Jack set his two cubs down gently near her paws, and Emily placed hers beside them. The lioness lowered her head, nuzzling each one as if counting them again. Then the teaching began. The cubs stumbled through the snow, unsure at first, but the lioness nudged them forward. They pressed tiny paws into the drifts, squeaking at the cold, jumping back, then trying again. She watched their every move with an intensity that made Jack's throat tighten. Even half-broken, she mothered them fiercely. When one cub slipped on a packed patch of snow, tumbling onto its side, the lioness took one weak step forward, but her legs gave out. Jack moved without thinking, scooping the cub up before it slid further down the slight incline. The lioness froze. Emily froze. Jack froze too, but he still held the cub. For a long second, nobody breathed. Then the lioness looked at him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something that almost looked like recognition. She blinked once, slowly, then eased her head down to the snow, resting it there, as though conceding that, for this moment, he could help her. Jack's lungs finally released their breath. "It's all right," he whispered to her. "I got him." Emily stared. Did she just let you do that?" Jack set the cub back near its siblings. "Looks like it." "That's not normal, Jack." "Nothing about this is normal." The lioness watched as her cubs explored the small clearing in wobbly, unsteady steps. Every twitch of her muscles spoke of instinct: stay close, protect, teach. She guided them the only way she could, nudging them, herding them, letting them climb over her. After a few minutes, she tested her own strength, lowering into a crouch and trying to stretch her injured leg. The muscles trembled with strain, but she held the position long enough for the cubs to copy her, tiny bodies flattening into clumsy hunting stances. Emily's voice softened. "She's teaching them how to stalk." Jack nodded. "She's a mother. Even dying won't stop that." But then the weather changed in a heartbeat. A gust of wind swept down from the ridge, colder and sharper than before. The lioness shivered violently, her legs buckling under her. "That's enough," Jack murmured, stepping forward. "That's plenty for today." He reached for the cubs again, and this time the lioness didn't protest at all. She watched him pick up each one, trusting him the way she had trusted him in the fire a year ago, the way she had trusted him enough to carry her cubs through a storm and lay them at his door. When she leaned toward the cabin, trying to follow, Jack and Emily stepped on either side of her, guiding her gently back inside. Her body sagged with exhaustion the moment she crossed the threshold, but she didn't fight. She collapsed onto the blankets with a deep, weary groan, the cubs curling around her belly almost instantly. Jack settled beside her, brushing snow from her fur. "You did good," he whispered. "You did real good." The lioness exhaled a long, trembling breath, the kind that sounded like both relief and surrender. Her cubs nuzzled into her chest, tiny tails flicking. Emily watched from near the stove, arms folded, voice very quiet. "Jack, she trusts you. Completely." Jack shook his head slowly. "No, not me." He looked at the lioness, the brave, battered creature who had walked 17 miles through death because she believed in only one thing left in the world. "She trusts what I did for her once," he said softly, "and she's hoping I can do it again." Outside, the snow gleamed under a cold blue sky. Inside, the fire crackled. The lioness closed her eyes, surrounded by her cubs, and finally fell into a deep, healing sleep. And Jack Whitmore sat beside her, knowing in his bones that the next chapter of their fight for survival and their fight to stay hidden was coming closer with every quiet heartbeat. Spring came slowly to the high country, as it always did, not in a sudden rush of green, but in small, stubborn signs. Water beginning to whisper under the ice of the creek, chickadees testing their voices in the brittle morning air, patches of brown earth showing through the retreating snow like old scars. By then, the lioness could walk without stumbling. The limp never left her completely. That burned shoulder and those torn pads had seen to that. But she moved with a quiet, cautious grace, never wasting a step. Her cubs were not really cubs anymore, but long-legged youngsters, their paws too big for their bodies, their eyes bright and curious, and just a little wild. Jack had started leaving the cabin door open on the milder days, letting the family drift in and out as they pleased. At first, they stuck close to the porch, playing in the bare patch where the shoveled snow had melted fastest. Then, slowly, the lioness began to lead them farther, down to the line of pines behind the cabin, then up the slope toward the rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. He watched them whenever he could, from the porch, from the kitchen window, from the shadow of the woodpile. The lioness would glance back now and then to be sure he was where she expected him to be. There was an agreement between them, unspoken but solid. He would watch over the clearing and the old logging road where the wolves sometimes passed, and she would take care of everything beyond. The teaching never stopped. He saw her show them how to hold still when the wind shifted, how to melt into the cover of boulders and brush, how to drop low and move in that rolling, silent way only big cats could manage. He watched her bring down a snowshoe hare one dusky evening, then step aside and let the cubs bungle their way through the business of finishing what she had started. It was messy and clumsy and necessary. "That's how you make a hunter," he murmured too, himself standing alone on the porch. One hard lesson at a time. Weeks passed that way. The wolves never came close again. though their howls floated down from the ridges now and then, reminders that the forest still had its own rules. Emily visited when she could, always parking her truck farther down the road, always checking the tree line before she approached. She helped with what she could. Medicine, supplies, quiet company when Jack's thoughts strayed too far into old grief. "You know this can't last," she told him one afternoon as they watched the lioness lead her young along the tree line. "I know," Jack said, and he did. He saw it every time the cubs tested their legs a little farther from the cabin, every time their mother let them stray just outside her immediate reach. Wild things were not meant to orbit a human home forever. They were meant to move, to claim, to vanish into their own lives. The goodbye came on a night so still it felt as if the whole valley were listening. Jack had been dozing in his chair by the stove, an old blanket pulled over his legs, when he woke with the uneasy feeling that someone was watching him. The fire had burned down to embers, painting the room in low red light. The clock said 3:02 a.m. He heard it then, that soft, familiar scrape at the door. Not the frantic scratching from the blizzard night, not the desperate plea of a dying mother, but a single, deliberate touch. Jack stood slowly, his heart already knowing. He slipped his feet into his boots and opened the door. The air outside was cold but gentle, edged with the smell of damp earth and thawing pine. The moon hung low and full, casting a pale road of light across the clearing. She was there. The lioness stood at the bottom of the porch steps, alone. No cubs tumbled around her feet, no small shapes pressed against her sides. She looked stronger now than she had the night she arrived, but there was a heaviness in her eyes that he understood. He had seen that look in the mirror the day he buried Linda. Jack stepped out onto the porch and sat down on the top step, not wanting to tower over her. For a long time, neither of them moved. "You got them this far," he said softly. "That's more than most get." Her tail flicked once. She sat down, as if in answer, her body angled toward him, her head high. In the moonlight, the scar on her shoulder shone, like an old piece of rope laid over smooth fur. "I guess this is where I tell you, I'll be all right," Jack went on, his voice low and a little shaky. "And you tell me the same, in your own way." The lioness studied him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she blinked both eyes at him at once. It was the kind of blink a house cat might give a trusted person, that soft, vulnerable closing of the eyes that said, for just that heartbeat, "I am not on guard against you." Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming here, for believing I could help. You gave an old man more purpose than he's had in a long, long time." She rose then, turning toward the trees. At the edge of the clearing, she paused and looked back over her shoulder one last time. Their eyes met, wild gold and tired blue, and then she slipped into the darkness without a sound. Jack sat on the porch for a long while after she was gone, listening to the faint rustle of the forest, the distant murmur of the creek, the ache in his own chest. He let the grief come, and with it something softer that felt a little like peace. Summer came and went. The snow on the peaks retreated, then returned. The wolves sang their songs on cold, bright nights. Life went on, as it always did in the mountains, trading one season's struggle for another's. He saw signs of them now and then, tracks along the ridge, a clean kill site where something strong and efficient had fed well, a flash of tawny movement deep between the trees. But he never went looking. This time, letting go meant staying away. It was in late autumn, with the first thin frost silvering the grass, that they came back. Jack was stacking firewood by the shed when he felt it, the prickling sense of being watched. He straightened slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves, and turned toward the hill that rose beyond the clearing. They stood there on the crest, 4 of them in a row. Not cubs any more. not quite full-grown. Lean, muscled young lions, their coats thick against the coming cold, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. They were too far for him to see their scars or their eyes clearly, but he didn't need to. He knew them. They didn't come closer. They didn't call out or pace or make any move that might be mistaken for begging. They simply stood side by side, looking down at the little cabin, at the man in the yard, at the slice of life they had passed through once on their way to becoming what they were meant to be. Jack felt his eyes sting. He didn't bother wiping the tears away. "You did it, girl," he said under his breath, not sure if he was talking to the lions on the hill or the memory of their mother. "You got them there." One of the young lions shifted its weight, flicking an ear. For a moment it seemed to lift its head a little higher, as if acknowledging something only it could see. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the four of them turned and walked along the ridge, their bodies melting into the trees until nothing remained but the memory of their shapes against the sky. Jack stood there alone, the chill creeping into his fingers, a quiet smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. The ache in his chest was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't just loss now. It was gratitude and a strange, humbling pride. The lioness had trusted him once, in fire. She had trusted him again, in snow. He had done what he could, and now her legacy moved through the wild on 4 strong sets of paws, owing him nothing, owing the world everything. That night, as he sat by the stove with a cup of coffee, cooling in his hands, Jack looked at the empty rug by the hearth and felt no urge to fill it with anything tame. Some loves, he realized, were never meant to stay. They were meant to arrive like a storm, tear your life open, and then move on, leaving you with new scars, yes, but also with a new way to breathe. Out beyond the window, somewhere in the darkness, 4 young lions hunted under the stars, and in the little cabin on the edge of the forest, an old man finally understood that sometimes the kindest, bravest thing you can do for something wild is exactly what that lioness had done when she put her cubs in his arms: let go and trust. If this story touched your heart even a little, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 1 or even a 0 in the comments. Anything, so I know you're here, listening, and sharing these moments with me. And if you'd like to join me for more true, soul-stirring stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe. There are so many journeys ahead. Stories of courage, trust, and unlikely bonds waiting just around the bend. I'd be honored to have you with me for the next one.